Immortality isn't a gift whispered on the wind, a divine blessing bestowed upon the worthy. It's the chill of ancient roots coiling around your bones, the unending echo of your own screams trapped within the heartwood of a forest that refuses to forget. It's the damp earth clinging to your skin, a second unwelcome epidermis that breathes with a life not your own. I know this because I live it, every agonizing, sunless moment. My name is Mark Chamberlain, or what's left of him, and this is the chronicle of how a father's desperate love became an eternity of penance, a testament to a single unforgivable transgression, in a place where the old ways still hold dominion, a place called Sector 7 of the Blackwood National Forest. The descent began, as such things often do, with a whisper of hope that curdled into necessity. Lily, my sweet Lily, with eyes like the summer sky and a laugh that could chase away the deepest winter, was fading. A rare, insidious illness was coiling through her small frame, a creeping frost that stole her energy, her light, leaving doctors shrugging with that particular brand of sympathetic helplessness that costs a fortune. The bills piled up like autumn leaves, a suffocating drift of ultimatums and final notices, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of our dwindling savings. Sarah, my wife, wore her worry like a shroud, her smiles becoming as fragile and infrequent as a winter rose, her nights haunted by the rhythmic beep of Lily's bedside monitor in our small Oak Haven home. It was during one of those bleak, pre-dawn hours, the air thick with unspoken fears and the cloying scent of antiseptic, that I saw the advertisement. Trail Warden, Sector 7, Blackwood National Conservancy. Remote posting, experienced individuals preferred, substantial remuneration. The pay was more than substantial. It was a lifeline, a desperate gasp of air in a drowning man's lungs. Blackwood Forest itself wasn't unknown to us. It loomed on the edge of Oak Haven, a dark, brooding expanse that swallowed the horizon. But Sector 7? That was different. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, if at all, a place of disappearances, of strange lights, of a silence that felt watchful, a place best left to the shadows and the things that thrived within them. The interview, if you could call it that, was with a gaunt, tired-looking man from the Conservancy, his eyes holding a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. He barely looked at my resume, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder as if expecting something to materialize from the very air of the sterile office. He mentioned the previous warden, Walter Green, was retiring. Abruptly, he'd added, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. The isolation, he'd said, wasn't for everyone. He didn't elaborate on what everyone might encounter, and a cold knot of unease began to form in my gut, a premonition I foolishly dismissed in the face of Lily's increasingly fragile hold on life. Sarah's apprehension was a palpable thing when I told her. Her hand clutched mine, her knuckles white. "Mark, that place. People say things." I'd soothed her with assurances I didn't entirely feel myself, painting a picture of solitude and honest work, the mountain air, the kind of peace we hadn't known in months. The money, I emphasized, the money would give Lily a fighting chance, access to the experimental treatments that were our last flickering hope. The weight of that hope, of her trusting gaze, was heavier than any pack I'd ever carry, a burden that would soon lead me into the deepest, most unforgiving heart of Blackwood. My initial days in the warden's cabin, a squat, rough-hewn structure nestled on the very fringe of Sector 7, were deceptively calm. Walter Green had already departed, leaving behind little more than the scent of stale pipe tobacco and an atmosphere thick with unspoken dread. The cabin itself was Spartan: a cot, a wood stove, a rickety table. Beyond its small, grimy windows, the trees of Sector 7 pressed close, their ancient boughs intertwined like the gnarled fingers of some colossal sleeping entity. The silence here was different from any I'd known. Not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all noise, all. The forest floor was a carpet of decaying leaves, centuries deep, muffling my footsteps as I made my first tentative patrols along overgrown trails marked only by faded blazes on bark that felt strangely warm to the touch. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, an undercurrent of something else, something vaguely metallic and unsettling, like old blood or rusted iron. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, filtering down in weak, mottled shafts that did little to dispel the gloom. It felt less like a forest and more like a cathedral built by a forgotten, malevolent god. Even then, before I found the notebook, before the rules became my twisted scripture, I felt it, the watching. It wasn't the furtive glance of unseen wildlife, the prickle on your neck that signals a predator near. This was vaster, more encompassing, as if every tree, every stone, every shadow held a fragment of some singular, ancient consciousness. I told myself it was the isolation, the stories, my own overwrought imagination fueled by desperation. But deep down, a primal part of me knew better. I was an intruder in a place that did not welcome intrusion, a place that had its own laws, its own secrets. My last clear memory of normalcy is of calling Sarah from the crackling satellite phone, the connection tenuous, her voice a fragile thread to a world that was rapidly receding. I told her Lily had a good day, a small lie, to shield her, to shield myself. The truth was, Lily's doctor had called, his tone grave, the experimental treatment our last resort. The forest seemed to listen, the wind sighing through the pines like a mournful chorus. I hung up, the silence of Sector 7 crashing back in, more absolute, more predatory than before. What price, I remember wondering, was too high for a child's life? The forest, I would soon learn, had its own very specific answer to that. The true unraveling began on the third day under a sky the color of bruised plums. A storm was brewing, the air heavy and electric, the usual oppressive silence of Sector 7 replaced by an expectant hush, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I'd been clearing a fallen log from what was generously marked on my outdated map as the Whisperwind Trail, the axe strokes echoing unnaturally in the stillness. It was then tucked into a rotten crevice at the base of an ancient, gnarled oak that I found it, a small, leather-bound notebook, its cover stained dark with age and what looked unsettlingly like dried blood. It felt cold to the touch, a deep, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the impending rain. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This had to be Walter Green's. There was no other explanation. I hesitated, a sense of trespass warring with an urgent, inexplicable curiosity. The wind picked up, a low moan that seemed to carry words I couldn't quite decipher, a language older than human speech. With trembling fingers, I opened the notebook. The paper was yellowed, brittle, the ink faded but still legible, written in a spidery, agitated hand. The first page bore a simple, chilling title: Rules for Surviving Sector 7. My blood ran cold, the term surviving hitting me with the force of a physical blow. There were 10 rules in total, each more bizarre, more unnerving than the last. They spoke of timings dictated by astronomical twilight and the first bird song, of winds that whispered your name, of children of the mist to be ignored, of a grotto of weeping stones to be avoided by walking backward. My rational mind, the part of me that still clung to the mundane world of Oakhaven and hospital corridors, screamed hoax, the ramblings of a man driven mad by solitude. Yet the meticulous detail, the sheer conviction in the looping script, rooted me to the spot. It felt less like a prank and more like a desperate final testament. As I read Rule 2, if the wind whispers your full name, cover your ears immediately and recite the alphabet backward until the sound ceases. Do not acknowledge the call. A sudden gust of wind swirled around the oak, carrying with it a sound so faint, so insidious, I almost dismissed it. Mark Chamberlain. It was my name, drawn out, raspy, as if spoken by a throat choked with dead leaves. My breath hitched. Coincidence, it had to be. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and an icy dread, colder than the notebook in my hand, began to seep into my very marrow. The forest, which moments before had been stirring with the pre-storm agitation, fell utterly, unnervingly silent. Then came the final entry on that first page, scrawled with more pressure, the ink almost tearing through the fragile paper. The forest watches. The forest remembers. And there is a final rule, unspoken but absolute, that must never, ever be broken. To break it is to invite a fate worse than any death this place can offer. My fingers, slick with a sudden cold sweat, tightened on the notebook. A final rule? Unspoken? What could be worse than the grotesque scenarios hinted at in the preceding 10? The air grew thick, heavy, making each breath a conscious effort, as if the very atmosphere was trying to suffocate the questions forming in my mind. I slammed the notebook shut, the sound of its worn leather cover snapping close, echoing like a gunshot in the profound stillness. My initial thought was to burn it, to eradicate this testament to one man's descent into madness. But I couldn't. It felt important, like a map to a minefield I hadn't known I was already treading. The wind died completely. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, no scuttling of unseen creatures. Just silence. A deep, resonant silence that was not empty, but full, pregnant with an ancient, unblinking awareness. It was the silence of a predator that has just scented its prey. A fat raindrop splattered on the notebook's cover, then another, and soon the heavens opened, a deluge that turned the forest floor into a slick, treacherous mire. I stumbled back towards the cabin, the notebook clutched to my chest like a talisman against a darkness I was only just beginning to comprehend. The rules, as outlandish as they seemed, had a terrifying ring of truth to them, a chilling authenticity that resonated with the palpable wrongness of Sector 7. The silence that had descended as I read the rules, it wasn't my imagination. The forest had reacted. It was listening. That night, sleep was a distant, unattainable shore. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind through the eaves, every drip of rain from the leaky roof seemed to carry a hidden meaning, a veiled threat. I reread the rules by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, the words swimming before my eyes, etching themselves into my memory. The children of the mist, the grotto of weeping stones, the old man of the roots. They sounded like something from a dark fairy tale, Yet the memory of my name on the wind, the sudden absolute stillness, lent them a horrifying credence. What had Walter Green truly faced out here? And the final unspoken rule. It gnawed at me, a splinter of ice in my mind. What could be so terrible that it wasn't even written down? What ultimate transgression could this ancient, watching forest demand such a severe, unspoken interdiction against? The rain lashed against the windows, the wind howled like a banshee, and I, Mark Chamberlain, a man who had once believed only in what he could see and touch, felt the first tendrils of a primal, existential fear begin to coil around his heart. The world I knew was shrinking, and the borders of Sector 7 were expanding, threatening to swallow me whole. The forest had set its hook, and I was already beginning to bleed. The days that followed were a masterclass in psychological erosion, each sunrise bringing not relief but a fresh wave of dread, a renewed test of Walter Green's twisted legacy. I tried, initially, to rationalize. The wind carrying my name, a trick of acoustics, the human mind's desperate pattern-seeking. The sudden silences, the natural caprice of a wilderness settling before a storm. But the forest, Sector 7, seemed almost eager to disabuse me of such comforting notions, to peel back the thin veneer of sanity I desperately clung to. The rules, I soon learned, were not suggestions. They were the brittle guardrails on a precipice overlooking an abyss of pure, unadulterated unreason. My patrols became a nerve-shredding gauntlet. The second rule, about the wind whispering my name, was invoked with alarming frequency. One moment, I'd be checking a trail marker. The next, that insidious, leafy murmur. Mark, Mark Chamberlain, come to us. Each time, my hands would fly to my ears, my teeth chattering as I stumbled through the alphabet backwards, Z, Y, X. The familiar sequence, a desperate anchor in a sea of encroaching madness. The whispers would fade, but the feeling of being addressed, of being known by something ancient and unseen, lingered like a foul taste in my mouth, a cold dread in my bones. Then came the Children of the Mist, as Rule 3 had forewarned. On a morning when the fog lay thick and cloying, clinging to the trees like spectral shrouds, I saw them. Small, pale figures flitting at the very edge of my vision, their forms indistinct, their movements too quick, too silent. They never fully emerged from the swirling gray, but their presence was a suffocating weight, a silent, collective stare that pricked at my sanity. I forced myself to look straight ahead, to ignore the peripheral dance of those ghostly shapes, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead, my breath catching in my throat. They fed on attention, the rule stated. I starved them, though every instinct screamed to turn, to confront, to understand. Lily's condition, relayed in Sarah's increasingly strained voice over the staticky satellite phone, was a constant, throbbing ache behind the immediate terrors of the forest. Each labored breath Lily took, each new complication, tightened the vice around my heart, fueling a desperate, reckless resolve. The money from this God-forsaken job was a trickle, barely enough to keep the wolves of debt from the door, let alone fund the experimental treatments that were her only hope. The forest knew this, I began to suspect. It sensed my desperation, my vulnerability, and it seemed to tailor its torments accordingly, prodding at my weakest points with a chilling, almost surgical precision. One afternoon, while navigating a particularly dense thicket of rhododendrons near what I guessed was the periphery of the dreaded Grotto of Weeping Stones, I heard it, a soft, guttural chuckling. I froze. A raven, preternaturally large, perched on a low branch, its obsidian eyes fixed on me with an unsettling intelligence. It cocked its head. "Lost, warden?" it croaked, its voice a gravelly imitation of human speech, the words perfectly formed, undeniably clear. Rule 5 slammed into my mind. If an animal of the forest addresses you with a human voice, offer it a portion of your food without hesitation. Never refuse or show fear. My hand, trembling violently, fumbled for the half-eaten apple in my pack. I extended the apple, my gaze carefully averted from those knowing, black-bead eyes. The raven hopped closer, snatched the fruit with a swift, almost contemptuous movement of its beak, and then, with another low chuckle that seemed to mock my terror, it flew off, disappearing into the dense canopy. I stood there for a long moment, my legs feeling like lead, my stomach churning. The encounter had lasted mere seconds, but it had irrevocably altered my perception of this place. This wasn't just a haunted forest, it was a sentient one, a place where the very laws of nature were bent, twisted, rewritten by an unseen, unknowable intelligence. The isolation began to wear on me, a slow, grinding abrasion of my sanity. The cabin, once a refuge, however meager, started to feel like a cage, its four walls pressing in. Sleep became a battlefield, a nightly struggle against a tide of nightmarish images, of whispering winds and misty children, of Lily's pale, trusting face. I found myself talking to the faded photograph of her I kept by my cot, a one-sided conversation filled with promises I wasn't sure I could keep, a desperate plea to a universe that seemed, at best, indifferent, and at worst, actively malevolent. The forest itself was a constantly shifting landscape of subtle horrors. Trees seemed to rearrange themselves when my back was turned. Trails I'd walked a dozen times would abruptly dead end or lead to unfamiliar, menacing groves. The quality of light was often wrong, too dim for midday, too lurid at dusk, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed with an implied life of their own. Even the air felt different within Sector 7, thicker, carrying scents that had no earthly origin. Sometimes sweet and cloying like overripe fruit, sometimes acrid and metallic like a freshly struck flint, sometimes like the breath of a charnel house. My journal entries from that period, scribbled by lamplight with a shaking hand, reflect my descent. They are a litany of fear, of doubt, of a growing, terrible certainty that I was caught in something far larger, far more ancient than I could comprehend. The rules are all that stand between me and what? I'd written one night, the ink smudged by a stray tear or a drop of sweat. It feels the desperation for Lily. It knows. Is this a test? Or is it a hunt? The forest offered no answers, only more questions, more shadows, more whispers on the cold, uncaring wind. The price for Lily's life, I was beginning to fear, was being tallied in increments of my own soul. My obsession with Walter Green's legacy deepened with each passing, terror-filled day. If he had survived here for any length of time, however damaged he'd become, his knowledge was paramount. The small, leather-bound notebook of rules was my Bible, my lifeline, but it felt incomplete, a fractured piece of a much larger, more terrifying puzzle. I began to search the warden's cabin with a new, almost frantic intensity, prying up loose floorboards, tapping at wall panels, sifting through the meager detritus of a life lived on the edge of madness. It was behind a loose stone in the crumbling hearth, a place I must have overlooked a dozen times, that I found it. It wasn't another notebook, but a slim, oilskin-wrapped packet of letters and a crudely drawn map, far more detailed than the official Conservancy issue. The letters, however, were not from Walter Green. They were older, penned in a different, more elegant script. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. The signature at the bottom of one was Thomas Rourke, Warden, Sector 7, Anno Domini 1923. Rourke. I vaguely recalled his name from some old Conservancy file I'd skimmed. A warden who had vanished without a trace nearly a century ago. His disappearance one of the first documented incidents in Sector 7's grim history. My blood turned to ice. Rourke's letters, addressed to a dearest Ilara, who I presume was his wife or sweetheart, began with the mundane observations of a man in a new, isolated posting, but they quickly devolved into something far more disturbing. He wrote of the forest's unnatural sentience, of its palpable, ancient will. He described encounters chillingly similar to my own. The whispers, the fleeting figures in the mist, the unsettling intelligence in the eyes of the forest creatures. But Rourke had delved deeper, or perhaps the forest had allowed him to see more, to understand the true nature of the entity that held dominion here. He didn't call it a haunting, he called it the ancient, a primordial consciousness woven into the very fabric of Sector 7. The rules, Ilara, one passage read, are not for our protection, not truly. They are accommodations, a fragile truce negotiated by those who came before, a way to move through its domain without drawing its full, terrible attention. The forest does not hate us. We are simply inconsequential, ants scurrying across the skin of a slumbering titan. But it can be provoked. It can be displeased. Rourke spoke of the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo, the grove of ancient heartwood, a central, almost sacred clearing dominated by a colossal, impossibly old tree, as the physical nexus of the ancient's power, its very heart. He called the intricate subterranean network of roots that webbed the entirety of Sector 7 its veins, pulsing with a slow, timeless life. The map Rourke had drawn showed this grove clearly, a stark, ominous circle in the center of his hand-drawn topography, and beside it a chilling annotation. The final rule, the one unspoken, is this: thou shalt not strike the heart. To wound the ancient is to invite not its wrath, for wrath is a fleeting human emotion, but its assimilation. It does not destroy what offends it, it incorporates. It makes the transgressor part of itself, an eternity of conscious awareness trapped within the unyielding wood, the cold earth. A shudder racked my frame. Assimilation. Walter Green's warning about a fate worse than any death suddenly took on a horrifying, concrete meaning. I spread Rourke's map on the rickety table, its faded lines and cryptic notes a stark contrast to the sterile, uninformative Conservancy chart. His depiction of Sector 7 was less a geographical survey and more a diagram of a living organism, with ley lines of energy, areas marked thin places, and warnings about song traps and memory pools. He believed the ancient wasn't merely in the trees, but was the trees, the soil, the stones, the very air. A collective, singular entity of immense, unknowable power. And the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo was its most vulnerable, most sacred point. The implications were staggering. The 10 rules Walter Green had left were not just arbitrary superstitions. They were a carefully curated set of behaviors, a protocol for interacting with a godlike being, honed over decades, perhaps centuries, by those unfortunate enough to be bound to this place. Each rule was designed to minimize offense, to acknowledge the forest's dominion without provoking its deeper, more terrifying aspects. And the unspoken final rule? It was the ultimate safeguard, not for the forest's survival, for what could truly threaten something so vast, so ancient, but for the survival of one's own soul. The knowledge was a crushing weight. I was not merely a warden in a remote, dangerous sector. I was an unwilling acolyte in an ancient, silent cult, treading a razor's edge between a fragile sanity and an eternity of unimaginable horror. The forest was not just watching, it was judging, assessing, its ancient mind weighing my every action, my every thought. And Lily, her fading life, my desperate need for a miracle, these were not just my private agonies. In the grand, terrible calculus of the ancient, they were potential levers, points of vulnerability it could exploit with a patience as deep and unyielding as the bedrock beneath my feet. My world had shrunk to the size of this oppressive, sentient wilderness. Oakhaven, Sarah, even Lily felt like figures in a distant dream, their reality overshadowed by the looming, terrible truth of Sector 7. The forest was a trap, not of branches and thorns, but of ancient power and a chilling, indifferent intelligence. And I, Mark Chamberlain, was caught fast. The rules my only flimsy shield. The unspoken final rule a constant, silent scream in the back of my mind. The path ahead was no longer just about survival. It was about navigating the whims of a living God, a God whose heart. The arrival of Sarah was like a sudden, jarring intrusion of harsh sunlight into a deep subterranean cave. She appeared unannounced one crisp autumn afternoon, her car a bright, alien speck of color against the drab greens and browns of Blackwood's fringe. The sight of her, her face etched with a worry that mirrored my own growing dread, was both a comfort and a profound source of guilt. I had tried to shield her from the true nature of this place, from the insidious tendrils of fear that were now so tightly wrapped around my own heart. But one look at me, and she knew. The forest was leaving its mark, and it was not a kind one. I was gaunt, my eyes hollow and haunted, my clothes perpetually damp with the forest's chill breath. I'm sure I spoke too quickly, too erratically, my conversation peppered with references to the rules, to the forest's awareness, phrases that must have sounded like the ravings of a lunatic to her ears, so firmly rooted in the sane, predictable world beyond Sector 7. She'd brought a basket temperatia with Lily's favorite cookies, a thermos of hot coffee, small comforts that felt almost obscene in their normalcy against the backdrop of the ancient, brooding wilderness that was now my constant companion and tormentor. "Mark, what is this place doing to you?" she'd whispered, her hand reaching for mine, her touch a fleeting anchor to a reality I was rapidly losing my grip on. "You look haunted. You need to leave. We'll find another way for Lily. This isn't worth it." Her words were a balm and a barb. The thought of escape, of abandoning this cursed post, was a siren song, a sweet, seductive promise of relief. But then the image of Lily, pale and fragile in her hospital bed, her small hand clutching mine, would rise in my mind, and the chains of desperation would tighten their hold. The experimental treatment Lily needed was astronomically expensive, a figure that made the Conservancy's substantial remuneration seem like pocket change. But it was something. It was the only something I had left. "I can't, Sarah," I'd said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "Not yet. I just need a little more time. I'm figuring things out here." Figuring things out. What a monumental lie that was. I was drowning, grasping at straws, the rules of Sector 7 a flimsy raft in a storm of cosmic indifference and burgeoning, terrifying sentience. Our conversation, held in the oppressive gloom of the warden's cabin, was strained, fractured by unspoken fears and the vast, unbridgeable gulf that had opened between my world and hers. She saw a man on the brink, teetering on the edge of madness. I saw a father fighting a desperate, losing battle against an enemy he couldn't comprehend for a prize he couldn't bear to lose. The forest itself seemed to listen, the wind sighing through the eaves like a mournful Greek chorus, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening, imbued with a watchful, almost mocking intelligence. It was during that strained visit that the insidious thought, a tiny, poisonous seed, first took root in the fertile soil of my desperation. If the forest was sentient, if the ancient was a conscious entity, as Rourke's letters suggested, could it be reasoned with? Could it be bargained with? Could a plea, an offering, a sacrifice, perhaps, sway its ancient will? The idea was madness, a terrifying leap into the abyss of superstition and wishful thinking. Yet, faced with Lily's deteriorating condition and the suffocating weight of my own powerlessness, even madness began to seem like a viable option. Sarah left as dusk began to bleed through the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the clearing. Her embrace was tight, almost desperate, her eyes filled with a mixture of love, fear, and a dawning, horrified understanding that the man she had married was slipping away from her, being claimed by something ancient and unutterable. Watching her car disappear down the rutted track, a fragile beacon of sanity retreating from the encroaching darkness, I felt a profound sense of isolation. The seed of that desperate idea, to bargain with the ancient, began to germinate, watered by my fear and fertilized by my grief. I pored over Rourke's letters again, searching for any hint, any clue, any precedent for such an interaction. He wrote of offerings left by forgotten tribes, of shamans who claimed to speak with the spirit of the wood, but his accounts were fragmented, steeped in the romanticism and colonial biases of his era. There was no clear path, no established protocol for petitioning a godlike entity whose very existence defied human comprehension. Yet, the thought persisted, a nagging, insistent whisper in the back of my mind, a counterpoint to the forest's own subtle, ceaseless murmurings. What if, I reasoned with the twisted logic of a desperate man, what if the ancient understood sacrifice? What if it understood value? My life, my sanity, my very soul, what were they worth in exchange for Lily's? The question hung in the oppressive air of the cabin, a silent, terrible interrogation. The forest offered no immediate answer, only the deepening gloom of the encroaching night and the cold, unblinking stare of a million unseen eyes. The internal fracture was complete. The man who believed in rules and reason was dying, and something else, something wilder and more desperate, was taking his place. The storm, when it finally broke, was a thing of savage, elemental fury, a physical manifestation of the turmoil raging within me. Rain lashed Sector 7 with the force of 1,000 whips, turning the already treacherous trails into slick, sucking quagmires. Wind howled through the ancient trees, their massive boughs groaning and creaking like the timbers of a ship caught in a monstrous squall. It was on the second day of this relentless deluge, with the satellite phone useless and the cabin feeling like a besieged outpost, that the forest decided to escalate its campaign, to shatter any lingering illusion I might have harbored about the efficacy of Walter Green's rules as a complete shield. I had been attempting to clear a blocked culvert near the cabin, a futile effort against the sheer volume of water, when a peculiar stillness fell over my immediate surroundings, the roar of the storm momentarily muted, as if a pocket of unnatural calm had formed around me. It was then that I noticed the path leading away from the stream, a path I swore hadn't been there moments before, its entrance marked by two curiously intertwined saplings. It seemed to beckon, an almost irresistible pull tugging at my senses. And despite a prickling unease, a voice in my head, no, not a voice, more a compulsion, urged me forward. I found myself walking towards it, drawn by an unseen current. The path led, inevitably, to the Grotto of Weeping Stones. Rule 4 screamed in my mind. The Grotto of Weeping Stones is not for you. If your steps lead you there, walk backward, retracing your exact path until you are well clear. Do not look at the tears on the stones. The grotto was a shallow, moss-covered depression, dominated by a cluster of dark, glistening boulders from which a clear, viscous liquid oozed, catching the dim, storm-filtered light like genuine tears. The air here was colder, heavy with an cloying, sorrowful scent that reminded me of wilted funeral flowers and damp earth. My heart hammered. I knew I had to turn, to retrace my steps, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. And then I slipped. The rain-slicked leaves offered no purchase, and I went down hard, my head narrowly missing one of the smaller, tear-streaked rocks. As I scrambled to regain my footing, my gaze, against my will, against every instinct of self-preservation, fell directly upon the largest of the weeping stones. For an instant, the tears seemed to swirl, to coalesce, and the surface of the rock became a murky, shifting window. I saw things. Faces contorted in silent screams, limbs tangled in an impossible, writhing mass, eyes wide with an eternal, uncomprehending terror. Stumbling away from that accursed place, the images seared into my brain, I felt a profound shift. The rules were not impenetrable. The forest could, if it chose, circumvent them, lure you, trick you, force your hand. My sense of a fragile, negotiated safety shattered. I was not a player in a game with clear boundaries. I was prey, and the hunter was toying with me, testing my fear, enjoying my fear. The illusion of control, however tenuous, was gone, replaced by a stark, terrifying vulnerability. The forest wasn't just watching anymore, it was actively engaging, its tendrils reaching deeper into my mind. Later that evening, as the storm began to abate, leaving behind a world sodden and shivering, I encountered the old man of the roots. He was simply there, standing by the edge of the clearing near my cabin, where no man should have been. He was, as Rourke had described, a figure seemingly sculpted from moss, gnarled wood, and ancient shadow, his form blending almost perfectly with the surrounding trees. Rule 9. If you encounter the old man of the roots, offer him a sip of fresh water from your canteen, but never meet his gaze directly. My hand trembled as I unslung my canteen, the metal cool against my clammy palm. I approached him slowly, my eyes fixed on the tangled roots that formed his feet. "Water, old one?" I managed, my voice a hoarse croak. He didn't move, didn't speak. But as I extended the canteen, a low, guttural sound emanated from somewhere within his shadowy form, a sound like rocks grinding together. Then a voice, clear and chillingly familiar, whispered directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. It was Lily's voice, sweet and innocent, yet laced with an undertone that was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. "Daddy," it said, the mental inflection perfectly hers. "The forest can help me. It can make me well again. But it wants something, Daddy, something precious, something from its own heart." My blood turned to ice water. The old man of the roots, this ancient, enigmatic emissary of the ancient, was using my daughter's voice, her image, to speak to me, to tempt me. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it, the calculated, predatory precision, stole my breath. This wasn't a test anymore. This was a direct offer, a poisoned chalice presented by a power that understood my deepest, most desperate desire. The illusion that I could somehow outwit or appease this entity, that I could maintain a detached, rule-bound existence within its domain, was utterly, irrevocably shattered. The old man of the roots, or whatever entity animated that moss and branch effigy, did not wait for an answer. As suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, or rather, he simply resolved back into the surrounding woods, leaving no trace, no sound, only the echo of Lily's voice in my mind, and the cloying scent of disturbed earth, and something ancient, like a freshly opened tomb. I stood there, canteen still outstretched, the world tilting on its axis. The forest wasn't just sentient, it was manipulative, cunning, and it had just laid its cards on the table. The rules, Walter Green's desperate litany of prohibitions and appeasements, felt laughably inadequate now. They were the scribblings of a child trying to ward off a hurricane with a chalk circle. The true game was far older, far more dangerous, and the stakes were impossibly high. The forest had offered a path, a terrible, seductive path towards Lily's salvation, a path that led directly to the unspoken final rule. And in the desolate landscape of my fractured mind, in the face of my daughter's fading life, that path, however perilous, however damned, began to look like the only one left to take. The illusion of safety was gone, and in its place, a terrifying, compelling invitation to sacrilege. The call from Sarah came 2 days later, the satellite connection surprisingly clear, as if the forest itself wanted me to hear every agonizing syllable. Lily had taken a turn for the worse. The doctors at Oakhaven General were talking in hushed, somber tones, using words like palliative and comfort measures. The experimental treatment, our last fragile thread of hope, was now deemed too risky, her small body too weak to endure it. Time, they said, was running out, measured not in weeks or days, but in precious, fleeting hours. Each word was a hammer blow, shattering the last vestiges of my carefully constructed composure, the fragile dam of denial I had built against the encroaching tide of despair. The forest seemed to press in around the cabin, its silence no longer merely watchful, but expectant, almost triumphant. The whispers of the wind carried not my name this time, but faint, heartbreaking echoes of Lily's laughter, a cruel, calculated torment. The old man of the roots' insidious offer, spoken in Lily's voice, replayed in my mind on an endless loop. The forest can help me. It wants something, something from its own heart. The rules, Walter Green's meticulous instructions for survival, Thomas Rourke's chilling revelations about the ancient, they all faded into an irrelevant background hum against the deafening roar of my grief and desperation. My system, the one I had painstakingly built upon adherence to those arcane laws, upon a fragile hope that I could navigate this perilous domain and somehow emerge unscathed with the means to save my daughter, collapsed utterly. What was the point of survival if Lily was lost? What was the value of my sanity, my soul, weighed against a single moment more of her precious life? The rational Mark Chamberlain, the man who had once believed in order and logic, died in that moment, replaced by a raw, primal instinct, the desperate, unreasoning drive of a father determined to snatch his child back from the very jaws of death, no matter the cost. The carefully catalogued fears, the meticulously observed prohibitions, they all burned away in the crucible of my agony. The intricate dance of appeasement I had performed for the forest's unseen masters now seemed a fool's errand. If the ancient could offer a cure, if it held the power of life and death within its gnarled woody grasp, then I would no longer be its supplicant. I would be its petitioner, its bargainer, perhaps even its challenger. A wild, reckless energy surged through me, born of grief so profound it bordered on madness. The rules of Sector 7 were no longer my guide. My love for Lily was my only compass, and it pointed directly towards the forbidden heart of the forest. I began to move with a feverish, almost manic purpose. Rourke's map, with its ominous circle marking the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo, the heart of the forest, became my new scripture. His warnings about assimilation, about a fate worse than death, were now just inconvenient footnotes, obstacles to be overcome or ignored. My mind, unhinged by grief, twisted his words, reinterpreting them to fit my desperate narrative. Assimilation, I reasoned with a chilling internal calmness, could mean a merging of essences, a transfer of vitality. To wound the heart, perhaps it wasn't a transgression, but an awakening, a way to force the ancient's attention, to compel its intervention. The cabin, once a symbol of my confinement, now felt like a staging ground for a desperate, sacred mission. I gathered what few tools I possessed. A sturdy woodsman's axe, its edge honed to a razor sharpness, a length of rope, my dwindling supply of rations. These were not the tools of a warden, but of a trespasser, a defiler. The irony was not lost on me, but it was a distant, academic observation, drowned out by the urgent, frantic thumping of my own. Sarah's tearful voice from our last call echoed in my ears, a lament for a husband she no longer recognized, for a future that was slipping away like sand through her fingers. But even her pain, her fear, became fuel for my terrible resolve. I would not fail Lily. I could not. If the price of her life was my own damnation, then it was a price I was willing, almost eager, to pay. The forest had laid a trap, using my deepest love as bait, and I was walking into it with my eyes wide open, not as a victim, but as a willing participant in a desperate, cosmic gamble. The intricate system of rules and rituals that had governed my existence in Sector 7 for weeks, the careful tiptoeing around unseen sensitivities, the constant vigilance against a myriad of spectral threats, it all dissolved. My world reconfigured around a single, terrifying objective: to reach the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo, to confront the ancient, and to wrest from its grasp the life of my child. The quiet warden, the fearful observer, was gone. In his place stood a man stripped bare of everything but a father's ferocious, unyielding love. A man prepared to break the unspoken final rule, to challenge the very heart of a god. The storm outside had passed, leaving the forest washed clean, the air crisp and cold. But a different kind of storm raged within me, a tempest of grief, love, and a terrifying, exhilarating madness. As I stepped out of the cabin, axe in hand, the forest seemed to sigh, a sound that was neither welcoming nor hostile, merely aware. It knew my intent. It had, perhaps, orchestrated it all along. My reconfigured self, a vessel of pure, desperate paternal will, was now set upon its tragic course. The system had collapsed, and from its ruins a new, terrible purpose had been born. My search through Walter Green's meager leavings, or what I now suspected were remnants from a succession of doomed wardens, including Thomas Rourke, had yielded the map and the letters, but I felt there had to be more. In my current state of heightened, almost feral awareness, every shadow in the cabin, every loose floorboard, seemed to whisper of hidden secrets. It was the scent, a faint, almost imperceptible trace of something acrid and metallic, similar to the strange undertones I sometimes caught on the wind in Sector 7, that drew me to a small, unassuming wooden chest tucked beneath the rickety cot. It was locked, but the rusted hasp yielded easily to the pry bar I'd found amongst the cabin's sparse tools. Inside, nestled amongst moth-eaten wool blankets and a few tarnished silver coins that looked centuries old, was another, smaller journal. This one was bound in dark, cracked leather, its pages filled with a cramped, spidery script that was undeniably Walter Green's. It was not a log of daily duties, but a raw, visceral account of his descent into the forest's madness, his desperate attempts to understand its rules, and his terror of the ancient. Many pages were filled with frantic, repetitive warnings about the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo, each more unhinged than the last. He, too, had known of Rourke's final rule. But it was a single, almost overlooked passage, scrawled on a loose leaf of paper tucked within the journal's final pages, that seized my attention, sending a jolt of terrible, perverse hope through my despair-numbed veins. Green, in a moment of what seemed like fleeting lucidity amidst his terror, had written, "Rourke was wrong about assimilation being only torment. The old ones, the tribes who came before even Rourke, they spoke of the heartwood not as a thing to be feared, but as a conduit. They believed a willing sacrifice, one who offered their own life thread to the Cernatantigo, could redirect a portion of its vitality, not to themselves, but to another bound by blood. A life for a life, mediated by the ancients' vast, indifferent power. A conduit. Redirect vitality. A life for a life. The words resonated with a dark, seductive power, aligning with the twisted logic my grief had already begun to construct. The old man of the root's message, spoken in Lily's voice, it wants something, something from its own heart, suddenly took on a new, terrifying dimension. What if it wasn't asking for a piece of its heart, but a piece for its heart? A new consciousness to add to its ancient collective, and in return, a spark of its immense life force could be channeled, directed towards Lily. It was a monstrous, desperate interpretation, but in my fractured state, it shone like a beacon. Green's note continued, his handwriting becoming more erratic. But the price is absolute. The forest does not give. It takes and transforms. The sacrifice does not die, not in any way we understand. They become anchored, a conscious root, a living part of the whole, their awareness stretched thin, an eternity of sensation without release. Rourke saw only the horror. The tribes saw balance, perhaps? A terrible, necessary bargain. He had underlined anchored 3 times, the pressure of his pen almost tearing the fragile paper. This was no mere warning. It was a blueprint for a damned salvation. This discovery, this fragment of desperate folklore filtered through the lens of 2 broken men, became my strategic turning point. It reframed my impending act of sacrilege. I wasn't going to the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo to merely wound the ancient, to demand its attention through an act of defiance. I was going to offer myself, to consciously, willingly break the final rule in a specific, ritualistic way, hoping to invoke this forgotten, terrible pact. My axe was not just a tool of desecration, but potentially an instrument of offering, the means by which I would sever my own life thread and attempt to graft it onto the heartwood, praying that its ancient power would, in turn, flow towards my dying child. The sheer audacity of it, the monumental arrogance of believing I could manipulate such a primordial force, should have given me pause. But I was beyond caution, beyond reason. Lily's fading breaths were a constant, desperate metronome counting down to an unbearable silence. Walter Green's note, Rourke's map, the old man of the root's cryptic pronouncements, they all coalesced into a single, terrible path. A strategy born of love so fierce it had become a destructive, all-consuming fire. The forest had shown me its power, its cruelty, its capacity for subtle manipulation. Now I would attempt to meet it on its own terms, to play its ancient game, with the only currency I had left, my own existence. I traced the route to the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo on Rourke's map with a trembling finger. It lay deep within Sector 7, in an area marked with symbols I couldn't decipher, but which radiated a palpable sense of dread even on the yellowed paper. The journey itself would be a trial, a gauntlet of the forest's lesser sentinels and insidious traps. But the discovery of Green's note had imbued me with a new, albeit terrifying sense of purpose. I was no longer just a desperate father flailing in the dark. I was an acolyte preparing for a sacred, monstrous ritual, a high-stakes gamble for my daughter's soul. The earlier rules, the ones about whispers and mists and talking ravens, now seemed like preliminary tests, minor hurdles designed to weed out the weak, the easily deterred. The true challenge lay ahead, in the heart of the ancient's domain, where the unspoken final rule held sway. My virada estratégica, my strategic turn, was complete. I would not just break the rule, I would shatter it, redefine it, twist it to my own desperate ends, hoping against all hope that the forest, in its vast, unknowable calculus, would accept my offering and spare my child. The cost, an eternity as a conscious root, was a price I was now grimly prepared to pay. The weight of this hidden knowledge, this terrible, potential path to Lily's salvation, settled upon me. It was a burden and a perverse sort of liberation. I was no longer fighting against the forest, but preparing to engage with it on a level few, if any, had ever dared. The game had changed, the stakes raised to an almost cosmic level. My intervention would not be a simple plea, but a profound, irrevocable act of self-immolation, a desperate attempt to rewrite the ancient contract between man and the primordial wild. The forest awaited my move, its ancient heart pulsing softly beneath the damp, dark earth. The decision, once made, settled into my bones with the cold, hard finality of a gravestone. There would be no turning back, no last-minute reprieve from the path I had chosen. The forest had pushed, prodded, and tempted, and I, in my boundless grief and desperate love, had taken the bait, twisting its ancient laws to fit the contours of my own personal apocalypse. As the first sliver of a sickly, new moon clawed its way above the jagged silhouette of the blackwood pines, I stepped out of the warden's cabin, the cool, polished haft of the woodsman's axe a reassuring weight in my hand. Rule 1: enter Sector 7 only between astronomical twilight and true dawn, was the first of Walter Green's carefully constructed defenses I consciously, deliberately shattered. Tonight, I would walk by the forest's moon, not man's. My journey towards the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo, as marked on Thomas Roch's ghostly map, was a descent into a living, breathing nightmare. The forest, no longer content with subtle whispers and fleeting shadows, seemed to rise up to meet me, its full, oppressive sentience pressing in from all sides. The air grew thick, heavy, like breathing in cobwebs and grave dust, each inhalation a struggle. The familiar trails, those faint paths I had patrolled with such trepidation, had vanished, swallowed by an encroaching, impenetrable darkness that even the weak moonlight could not pierce. I navigated by instinct, by the crude lines on Roch's map, and by a strange, unnerving pull towards what I knew to be the heart of this ancient, terrible place. The lesser rules, those initial 10 commandments of survival, were tested with a relentless, almost malicious frequency, as if the forest were throwing its entire arsenal at me, a final, desperate attempt to deter me from my sacrilegious pilgrimage. The wind howled my name, not in whispers now, but in roaring, accusatory shouts. "Mark Chamberlain, trespasser, defiler!" I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to bypass them, resonating directly within my skull, a cacophony of condemnation. The children of the mist swirled around me in a suffocating, ghostly ballet, their pale, indistinct faces pressing close, their silent judgment a palpable weight. I stumbled on, ignoring them, their presence a chilling reminder of the souls already claimed. Animals, twisted mockeries of their natural forms, crossed my path. A deer with eyes that glowed with an internal hellish light, its antlers festooned with weeping human-like hair, stood barring my way, its guttural growl a clear warning. A parliament of owls, their heads rotating a full 360 degrees, hooted in a discordant chorus that sounded like a dirge. I offered no food, no appeasement. My mission was singular, my resolve absolute. These were distractions, guardians of the threshold, and I would not be swayed. The forest, it seemed, was unaccustomed to such blatant, unwavering defiance of its established protocols. The grotto of weeping stones loomed unexpectedly out of the darkness, its tear-streaked boulders gleaming with a malevolent, sorrowful light. The compulsion to look, to witness again those trapped, tormented souls, was almost overwhelming. But this time I was prepared. I averted my gaze, focusing on a point just beyond the cursed place, reciting Lily's name like a mantra, a shield against the grotto's insidious psychic pull. The My shadow, under the sickly cast of the forest's moon, writhed and stretched, detaching itself from my feet to dance a grotesque, independent jig beside me. Rule 7. If your shadow detaches, step on it firmly 3 times and declare your name and that you walk in light. There was no light here, only varying degrees of oppressive, ancient darkness. But I stomped on the capering shade, my boot heel grinding it into the damp earth, my voice hoarse but steady. I am Mark Chamberlain, and I walk this path for my daughter. The shadow hissed, a sound like escaping steam, and reluctantly reattached itself, though it seemed to flicker and tremble at my heels, an unwilling, resentful companion. The closer I drew to the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo, the more the forest's resistance intensified. The very ground beneath my feet seemed to try and impede my progress, roots snaking out like grasping tentacles, the earth turning soft and treacherous, threatening to suck me down into its loamy embrace. The trees themselves seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal arms, their leaves whispering threats and temptations in a sibilant chorus. My radio, which I hadn't even thought to bring, crackled to life from where it lay forgotten in my pack, emitting not static, but a slow, deliberate, sickening heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. The pulse of the ancient itself, a sound that vibrated through my bones, shaking me to my core. I ripped the device from my pack and smashed it against a rock, silencing its ominous rhythm. The axe in my hand felt less like a tool and more like an extension of my will, a conduit for my desperate, sacrilegious intent. Each swing that cleared a path through the grasping undergrowth was a blow against the established order of this place, a declaration of my refusal to submit. I was no longer a warden, no longer a mere observer bound by fear and arcane rules. I was an active agent, an intruder with a purpose, a father prepared to tear down the gates of hell itself if it meant a chance, however slim, to save his child. My contra-attack was not against a physical enemy, but against an ancient, implacable power, against the very laws that governed this cursed, sentient wilderness. As I finally broke through a last dense thicket of thorns, the air before me shimmered, and a profound, unnatural silence fell. The Bosque del Duramen Antiguo lay before me, a vast, circular clearing, bathed in an eerie, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the very soil. And in its center, dominating the landscape, its impossibly vast trunk reaching towards the bruised sky like a pillar supporting a dying world, stood the Cerne Antigo, the heartwood tree. It was more ancient, more colossal, more terrifyingly alive than anything Rourke's descriptions or my own fevered imagination could have conceived. My great, decisive action was at hand. The forest had tried to stop me, and it had failed. Now I stood before its heart, ready to make my terrible final offering. The Bosque del Duramen Antiguo was not silent in the way the rest of Sector 7 often was. Here, the silence was a living entity, a vast, resonating chamber of pure, unadulterated ancientness. It pressed against my eardrums, a physical weight that made the frantic hammering of my own heart seem like a trivial, fleeting intrusion. The air was cold, still, and carried the scent of petrichor, deep earth, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sweetness, like a flower blooming out of season in a forgotten tomb. The phosphorescent glow that bathed the clearing pulsed softly, rhythmically, in time with that slow, ponderous heartbeat I had heard on the radio, the lifeblood of the ancient made visible. The Cerne Antigo, the heartwood tree, was a monument to an age before man, before memory. Its trunk was a universe of bark, gnarled and fissured, wide enough to swallow my cabin whole. Its branches, bare of leaves in this eternal twilight clearing, clawed at the sickly moonlight like the supplicating arms of a forgotten god. And its roots, they were not mere anchors, but colossal, serpentine thoroughfares of ancient life, spreading out from the base of the tree in every direction, disappearing into the glowing earth, a visible testament to the interconnected web that Rourke had described, the veins of the ancient. It was here, in this terrible, sacred place, that Rule 6, do not remain for more than 5 minutes. Do not touch, do not take, do not leave anything but footprints, and the ultimate, unspoken final rule were to be irrevocably shattered. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged, painful gasp. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the heartwood tree was a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs, making my knees tremble. This was not just a tree, it was a cathedral of primordial power, a living altar to a force beyond human comprehension. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to flee, to prostrate myself, to beg forgiveness for my audacious, sacrilegious intrusion. But the image of Lily, pale and fading, her small hand lost in mine, burned brighter than the eerie glow of the clearing, a desperate, unwavering flame in the face of this cosmic, indifferent majesty. I took a step forward, then another, the glowing moss and fungi crunching softly beneath my boots. The forest, the ancient, seemed to hold its breath, its myriad unseen eyes fixed upon me, this insignificant mortal daring to approach its most sacred sanctum with an axe in his hand and madness in his heart. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, more profound. I could feel the immense, slow thrum of its life force through the soles of my boots, a vibration that resonated deep within my bones, a power that could snuff out my existence with less thought than I would give to crushing an ant. Reaching the base of the colossal trunk, I stood before one of the largest roots, a gnarled, muscular python of wood thicker than my own body. This was it, the moment of truth, the culmination of my desperate gamble. My hands, slick with sweat, tightened around the haft of the axe. I could feel Walter Green's terror, Thomas Rourke's awe, the despair of countless others who had stood on this precipice, who had perhaps contemplated this ultimate transgression. But their warnings, their fates, were now just whispers in the wind, drowned out by the thunderous roar of my fatherly love, my unbearable grief. I raised the axe, its polished head catching the spectral light of the clearing, a tiny, defiant gleam in the face of this overwhelming, ancient darkness. For a fleeting, terrible instant, doubt assailed me. What if Green was wrong about the willing sacrifice? What if Rourke was right about assimilation being only torment? What if this act, this desperate, loving sacrilege, only damned me and failed to save Lily? But it was too late for doubts. The die was cast, the path chosen. I closed my eyes, Lily's face swimming in the darkness behind my lids. And with a guttural roar that was more animal than human, I brought the axe down. The impact was not what I expected. There was no satisfying thud of steel biting into wood, no spray of splinters. Instead, the moment the axe blade touched the impossibly hard, ancient bark of the root, a blinding, searing white light erupted from the point of contact, engulfing the clearing, engulfing me. A sound, not a sound for human ears, but a psychic scream of unimaginable magnitude, tore through my consciousness, a sound of immense, ancient pain, of violation, of a colossal, slumbering entity rudely, violently awakened. It was the sound of a god being wounded. Pain, absolute and all-consuming, exploded through my every nerve ending. It was as if my very atoms were being torn apart and reassembled in some new, horrific configuration. I felt my connection to my own body, to my own identity begin to fray, to dissolve. The axe clattered from my nerveless grasp. And then, from the wound I had inflicted on the great root, and from the earth all around me, and from the very trunk of the heartwood tree itself, tendrils of living wood, fine as spider silk yet strong as steel, emerged, writhing, questing, coiling. They found me, enveloped me, not with crushing force, but with a gentle, inexorable, terrifying intimacy. They pierced my skin, my flesh, my bones, not to inflict further pain, but to merge, to integrate. I felt my consciousness expanding, shattering, blending with something vaster, older, incomprehensibly complex. I was the tree, I was the roots, I was the soil, I was the wind sighing through branches that were my own limbs. I was Mark Chamberlain, and I was the Ancient, my individual awareness a tiny, terrified drop in an ocean of timeless, collective being. The final rule was broken, and my contact with the Absolute, my terrible offering, had begun. The forest had accepted. The moments, or eons, that followed the breaking of the final rule are impossible to quantify in human terms. Time, as I had known it, ceased to exist, replaced by the slow, ponderous rhythm of the forest's ancient life. The turning of seasons compressed into heartbeats, centuries into fleeting thoughts. My consciousness, once a singular point of terrified awareness, was now stretched thin, woven into the vast, intricate tapestry of the Ancient's being. I was a nerve ending in its colossal body, a whisper in its million-voiced chorus, a captive audience to the slow, inexorable grinding of geological time and the silent, ceaseless thoughts of a primordial god. The pain of the initial merging, that cataclysmic tearing and reknitting of my essence, eventually subsided, not into numbness, but into a constant, low-thrumming awareness of everything. I felt the drip of moisture from a leaf a mile away, the burrowing of a beetle deep within my wooden flesh, the subtle shift of tectonic plates far beneath the earth. I felt the sun on bark that was now my skin, the frost cracking ancient stone that was now my bones. It was an existence of pure, unfiltered sensation, an overwhelming deluge of information that threatened to drown what little remained of Mark Chamberlain. I was immortal, yes, but it was the immortality of a rock, of a tree, of the insensate earth itself, yet cursed with a human mind to perceive it all. My physical body, I could vaguely sense, was no more, or rather, it had been subsumed. I was the gnarled root I had struck, now healed and pulsing with a strange, cold vitality. I was part of the heartwood tree, its ancient sap, a thread in its immeasurable rings. I was the moss that clung to its bark, the fungi that bloomed in its shadow. My humanity was a fading echo, a ghost limb still twitching with phantom pains and forgotten memories. The terror remained, a cold, hard knot in the center of my dispersed being, but it was now overlaid with a vast, indifferent calm, the ageless patience of the ancient. And Lily? In the midst of this cosmic, terrifying transformation, a single, clear awareness pierced through the overwhelming sensory input. She was alive. More than alive. I could feel, with a certainty that transcended all earthly logic, a thread of vitality, a spark of that immense, redirected life force flowing outwards from me, from the heartwood, across the miles, towards a small, fragile body in a hospital bed in Oakhaven. It was a faint, almost imperceptible current in the vast ocean of the ancient's being, but it was there. My desperate, monstrous bargain, it seemed, had been accepted. A life for a life. Or rather, an eternity of weeks, or perhaps months later in the human world, the news would have reached Sarah. Lily's miraculous, inexplicable recovery. Doctors would call it a spontaneous remission, a 1 in a billion chance, a testament to her fighting spirit. They would never know the true cost, the terrible, silent transaction that had taken place in the phosphorescent gloom of a forgotten forest clearing. Sarah would rejoice, her prayers answered, her relief immense, though her joy would forever be tinged with the sorrow of a husband lost, a man who had simply walked into the woods and never returned. It was better that way, far better than knowing the truth of my current unholy state. The forest, the ancient, had kept its end of the perverse bargain, though its motives remained as inscrutable as the stars. Perhaps it saw me as a curiosity, a fleeting amusement. Perhaps my willing sacrifice, as Walter Green's note had termed it, had satisfied some ancient, forgotten protocol. Or perhaps, in its vast, alien consciousness, it simply did not differentiate between a life given and a life taken, only in the balancing of some cosmic, incomprehensible equation. The why was beyond me, lost in the labyrinth of its ancient thoughts. All that remained was the is. Lily lived, and I endured. My awareness, though part of the whole, retained a sliver of its former self, a shard of Mark Chamberlain embedded in the timeless consciousness of the forest. I could not speak, I could not move in any human sense, but I could perceive. I could remember, and I could feel. I felt the slow, agonizing passage of time, the endless cycle of growth and decay, the silent, ceaseless hunger of the ancient for what? More life? More awareness? More anchors like me? I was a prisoner in a vast, living cathedral, a sentient gargoyle on its ancient walls, a witness to its silent, eternal mysteries. The transformation was complete, irrevocable. I had sought to intervene, to strike a blow, to make a demand, and in return, the ancient had simply absorbed me. It had taken my offering, my life, my very being, and woven it into its own eternal, indifferent existence. I was no longer Mark Chamberlain, father, husband, warden. I was a part of Blackwood, a whisper in the rustling leaves, a shadow in the deepest groves, a conscious root tethered to the heartwood, an immortal, unwilling guardian of its terrible secrets. The final rule had been broken, and the consequence was not death, but this, an eternity of being, an eternity of knowing, an eternity of it not letting me die. The transfer of vitality to Lily, I sensed, was a finite thing, a measured expenditure from the ancient's vast reserves. Once she was healed, the connection would fade, sever. She would live her life, unaware of the price paid, of the monstrous, loving sacrifice made in the heart of a forgotten forest. And I would remain, anchored, watching, feeling, remembering, a silent, eternal testament to a love that dared to challenge a god, and paid the ultimate, unending price. This was my new reality, my unending consequence. Years unfurl like the slow growth rings of the heartwood tree to which my consciousness is now inextricably bound. Or perhaps it has been decades. Time for me has lost its sharp human edges, blurring into a vast, cyclical expanse of sun and moon, of frost and thaw, perceived not through eyes or skin, but through the collective senses of the forest itself. I am Mark Chamberlain, and yet I am not. I am a fragment of awareness adrift in the ancient mind of Blackwood, a silent, unseen observer tethered to the very roots of this sentient, primordial world. My sacrifice, my terrible bargain, echoes in the eternal rustle of leaves, a story known only to the wind and the deep, dark earth. Lily, my sweet Lily, lives. I feel her, sometimes, as a distant, faint warmth in the vast network of the ancients' perception, a life. The Conservancy still sends wardens to Sector 7, new faces, fresh lambs to the subtle, ancient slaughter. They are younger now, perhaps, more reliant on technology that invariably fails within these borders, less attuned to the old ways, the hushed warnings. Walter Green's notebook of rules, I sense, still circulates, a tattered, photocopied relic passed down with grim reverence, its 10 commandments a flimsy shield against the forest's deeper machinations. Sometimes I try to influence. A sudden chill in the air as a new warden strays too close to the grotto of weeping stones, a branch that falls to block a path leading towards the Bosque del Duramen Antiguo. Feeble attempts, ghost whispers from a consciousness stretched too thin. They speak of me now, the new wardens, in hushed, fearful tones around their flickering campfires. Another layer added to the grim folklore of Sector 7. They call me the Guardian Partido, the Broken Warden, the one who dared to strike the heartwood and was changed. They say if you listen closely on still nights, when the moon is a blood-orange eye in the sky, you can hear a sound like a man weeping from within the oldest trees, or feel a profound, unshakable sorrow emanating from the very soil beneath your feet. That sorrow, I suppose, is mine, a constant, low-thrumming ache in the heart of the ancient. The final rule, the unspoken one, has found its voice in my eternal penance. It is whispered now, not written, a chilling addendum to Green's list. Never seek to harm the heartwood, for its vengeance is not death, but an eternity of union. There is one who learned this. He is the forest now, and the forest is him, and his torment is a lesson for all who would defy the ancient. I am a cautionary tale, a living, breathing, in a horrifying, botanical sense, embodiment of the ultimate transgression. My love for Lily, so fierce, so absolute, has become a terrifying monument. The ancient remains, vast, indifferent, its slow thoughts spanning eons. My consciousness, a tiny spark within its immense being, does little to alter its fundamental nature. It continues its timeless existence. Sector 7, its sacred, inviolable domain. The children of the mist still flit through the fog. The old man of the roots still offers cryptic counsel or cruel temptations to the unwary. The cycle continues, the forest watches, and occasionally it incorporates. I am not the first to be anchored here, I realize with a chilling certainty, merely the latest addition to its silent, conscious collection. Sometimes, through the shared senses of the forest, I perceive the faintest echoes of other trapped awarenesses, other conscious roots. Thomas Rourke, perhaps, and countless others whose names are lost to time, their individualities eroded, their essences woven into the deep, dark fabric of Blackwood. We are a silent, suffering choir, our collective, unspoken anguish, the true music of this ancient, terrible place. My sacrifice saved Lily, yes, but it also fed the ancient, strengthened its hold, added another layer of living warning to its formidable defenses. My future is the forest's future, an unending expanse of seasons, of slow growth and patient decay, of watching the human world encroach and retreat at the edges of my being. I am a part of the rustling leaves, the sighing wind, the deep, cold earth. I am the silent scream in the heart of the wood, the sorrow in the weeping stones. I broke the final rule in the forest, driven by a love that knew no bounds, and now it won't let me die. It will never let me die, for I am where I belong, rooted in my regret, an eternal, conscious part of the price. And the forest, it just is.